So, one of the major objectives that we've covered thus far has been the regional differences in British colonies. So, you have the New England settlements further north, and that's going to be what becomes Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. Of course, Massachusetts was the first of those New England colonies. And then the southern colonies, which started with Virginia, and then those southern colonies grow, and we'll talk about a few of those other southern colonies here in just a moment. But in wrapping up New England colonies, it's important to understand that their relationships with Indians changed over time. These are the same people that celebrated the first Thanksgiving with the Massasoit Indians. But as increasing numbers of settlers from England came across the Atlantic and inhabited the northern part of the Atlantic seaboard, increased tensions grew between those settlers and the natives in the region. There are two conflicts, and one of those conflicts is specifically about land encroachment. The Pequot Wars were simply about land encroachment. As white settlers grew in the Connecticut Valley, Indian tribes like the Pequot were forced, forced farther and farther west, and because of land claims and rights that they felt they had to these lands, the Pequots raided New England settlements, and in retaliation, um, these English men and women were pretty brutal in their response. The Pequot Wars ended with the white settlers barricading the Pequots in their village and burning them up, many alive. So it represented the end of the Pequot tribe. And then finally, King Philip's War. It's called by some historians Metacomet's War. Metacomet is a Wampanoag chief, and he rallied together other chieftains of the region to attack New England settlements over it was more of a political dispute. Two braves had been tried in a New England court for murder. They'd been convicted and they'd been hanged. And so these natives felt like the white settlers were imposing their judicial law on them, and, in a show of superiority. And native people retaliated against that. Metacomet attacked New England settlements. That's a typical native war tactic, that raiding, surprise attack, guerrilla warfare. And in response, Metacomet was captured. He was beheaded. His wife and children were also captured, and they were sold into slavery. And so here's an image here of the aftermath of Metacomet's War, or King Philip's War. So the last learning objective that we will cover is assessing all of the regions in which the British colonies were inhabited. So there are three regions. You have the southern colonies and the New England colonies. We know those New England colonies are the northern colonies, but then there are also the middle colonies. The middle colonies are made up of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Those are your big three middle colonies: New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And we're going to start looking into those colonies by just tracing a quick history of New York. So the colony of New York was first inhabited by the Dutch. The Dutch were interested in trade, particularly the fur trade. Pelts were they were less available in Europe. Overhunting had decreased the amount of beaver there, and here in the Americas, the pelts were very thick, especially in the northern region where colder climates were, and so they were much desired. The Dutch wanted to get in on that very lucrative fur trade, so that was the reason for their settlement on Manhattan Island. Not a lot of people from the Netherlands came in large number to inhabit this colony, and so the Dutch were very much open to people coming from all across Europe, which means that this colony became diverse. So trade, established for the purpose of trade, and diverse peoples, those you can identify as hallmarks of the colony that becomes New York colony. So in 1664, the British recognized the weakness in the Dutch's ability to maintain and control the colony, and an English fleet comes up the Hudson River into New York Harbor, and they just take over. It's a fairly peaceful takeover, but the British just take it. And that's in 1664, and they rename the colony New York. A section of the colony is given to a friend of the proprietor, and it's called New Jersey. So both New York and New Jersey were carved out of what was previously a Dutch colony. You want to remember that. There may be a multiple choice question on the quiz that the Dutch were the first to settle and claim New York. So we've identified two of those middle colonies, now the third, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, different in its history and settlement. It was much more like the northern colonies in that it's the purpose of the settlement was for religious reasons. William Penn was a Quaker, so we're talking about the age of the Protestant Reformation, where there are large numbers of Christian groups that aren't Catholic, and the Quakers are one of those Protestant groups. Now, what are some key characteristics of Quakers? They are pacifist, which means that they take the position of non-violence. They do not fight. They look for peaceful resolutions to conflict. They are extremely tolerant. Okay, I want you to make note of this. Of all of the ideas of freedom of religious thinking, the Quakers are the most open-minded. Like when you look at Roger Williams and Rhode Island and the religious act of tolerance there, his ideas of separating church and state. He wanted the freedom for Christians to choose their denomination. William Penn and the Quakers believed in true religious tolerance, like people can practice any religion that they deem fit and right for them. The Quakers did not impose their religion on Indians. They did not impose their religion on Jews. And so the Quakers practice the most open form of religious tolerance and freedom of religion. So also women in the Quaker community are viewed as equals to men intellectually, and that's something that's quite unique. And the Quakers lived very peacefully with Indians for about 50 years. All men that come into the Quaker colony become landowners. They're given 50 acres of land, all adult men. They practice democracy there. There's colonial assembly. And we talked about that idea of religious freedom. So the Quakers have peaceful relations with natives for over 50 years. Eventually, the Quakers become a minority. Because they're so open to people who aren't Quaker over time, they become a minority in their colony. Okay, so let's talk about one or a few last colonies. The colony of Maryland. Maryland is considered a southern colony. Okay, so Maryland here is in yellow. Maryland in yellow, it's just north of Virginia, and their characteristics are similar. Like we see a tobacco agricultural economy in Maryland. They even have a headright system, and they use indentured servants for the first half of the century of that 1600s when the British are dominating along the Atlantic seaboard. Maryland is similar in that respect, but Maryland also has another key characteristic that you want to note. The colony of Maryland was created as a safe haven for Catholics. So think Mary, Maryland. So it was created as a safe haven for Catholics. Catholics were being persecuted very heavily in this Protestant Reformation in England, and Lord Baltimore, the proprietor, the owner of the colony, bought it as a place for Catholics to live peacefully. Interestingly enough, not many Catholics came, and so Protestants actually became the majority in Maryland, which led the legislature of Maryland to pass an act, a Religious Toleration Act, which forbade persecution of Christians. Again, we see a movement towards religious tolerance, which in this age is profound and it's progressive, but it's not the truest form of religious tolerance. So the Maryland Act of Religious Toleration protects Christians against persecution. Okay, and then Georgia. James Oglethorpe was the founder of Georgia. Georgia is the last of the 13 colonies to be established. It was established in 1753 or 1752, excuse me. And it was established as a safe haven for debtors. Like if you were in debtor's prison in England, this is a place that you could come and work off a debt. So originally slavery was outlawed in Georgia. They didn't want the use of slaves there because they wanted it to be a place that was dependent on white labor from England for these debtors. However, the same trend with the indentured servants, as fewer and fewer became available, fewer and fewer were willing to come into the New World, they turned in Georgia to slave labor. And in Georgia, having a more southern latitude and the climate being different than here in Virginia, many rice paddies were along the Atlantic seaboard here in the south, and rice was a dominant cash crop here. One other cash crop I want you guys to know is indigo. Indigo was harvested in the Carolinas. So the three major cash crops, tobacco, indigo, and rice are the three major cash crops that these southern colonies are aggregating. Okay, so you have three regions of British colonial America. You have New England, your northern colonies here in green shades. Then you have your middle colonies here in shades of blue, and then your southern colonies here farther south, beginning with Maryland. Delaware is kind of in flux. Some people characterize it as a middle colony, while others characterize it as a southern colony. Okay, so 13 British colonies with three distinct regions that have different economies, that have different social aspects and cultural aspects, and definitely have different political aspects.